Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and you're welcome to the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Housing, Local Government and Heritage. And we're in public session now to discuss the right to housing. And we're joined in the room by Mr. Wayne Stanley, Ms. Aoife Kelly-Desmond and Mr. Gavin Elliott from Home for Good. And remotely we're joined by Professor Colm O'Cinada of the University College London. Mr. Stanley, on behalf of Home for Good, please, and you're welcome back to the Oireachtas Committee. Thank you. Thank you for your attendance today.
And thanks to the committee for the invitation. My colleague Aoife and I will give the opening statement together. So firstly, Home for Good would like to extend our thanks to the committee for the invitation to present on the right to housing, and particularly the ongoing engagement of the committee members and the committee as a whole on this important topic. Home for Good, as the committee is aware, is a coalition of organisations and individuals who believe that constitutional change is needed as an essential underpinning for any programme to tackle our housing and homelessness crisis. Many of our members, as you know, are advocates from frontline organisations, and through that work we understand how important a right to housing is for those experiencing housing exclusion, homelessness, and for those living in inadequate, unsafe, insecure or overcrowded accommodation. More generally, as citizens, we understand the importance of a home as the fundamental social and economic infrastructure of our society. The meaning of home became abundantly clear during the COVID-19 pandemic, which starkly demonstrated the importance of an adequate home to keep ourselves and our families safe. As we've advocated for a redoubling of efforts for those in housing distress during the pandemic and subsequent to the pandemic, we are more certain than ever of the need to amend our constitution to ensure that the necessary policies can be implemented to end the housing and homelessness crisis in Ireland. The committee will be aware the last number of months have seen an unwinding of COVID restrictions in the areas of housing, as many of us have returned to life or some version of normal. What we have seen in housing is a return to crisis. Homelessness in the last 6 months has increased 16%, and we now have over 10,000 people living in emergency homeless accommodation, including over 3,000 children. The cost of housing and rent has continued to grow, and supply has constricted further. In the 3 months of this year, 1,132 notices to quit have been issued, the highest since data collection started in 2019. 3,818 eviction notices have been issued since the COVID ban on evictions was lifted last April. While the recent heightening of the housing crisis has had a number of driving factors, we firmly believe that the seeds of the crisis were sown in the belief that home, or in the understanding of home, in the belief that home is not understood as central to our social infrastructure and is not a right for individuals and families in Ireland. More generally, the lack of balance in our constitution has facilitated the development of a housing system based on financial commodification to a level that now undermines the capacity of too many to participate fully in society. Home for Good have welcomed the recent support for and the development towards a referendum on the right to housing, particularly the launch of the Housing Commission, which has introduced a subcommittee tasked to bring forward wording on it for a referendum on housing. The Housing Commission is due to present its deliberations on a referendum on housing in the coming months. Housing in Ireland is truly in a state of crisis at all levels, and a referendum on the right to housing cannot be delayed. We hope that the recommendations from the upcoming report lead to timely progress towards a positive referendum on the right to housing. Home for Good want to ensure that 2 key actions are taken as next steps to progress the right to housing: that a referendum is called as soon as is practical after the Commission publishes its report, and to ensure this, we hope the Commission in its report will include a positive proposal for wording for a referendum on the right to housing. From our perspective, this would ideally build upon the work that Home for Good has done in this area. Of course, we remain open to engagement with the Commission. The sense of urgency for a referendum on a right to housing is driven by the ongoing housing crisis. We cannot afford any more postponement. In 2018, during his time as Taoiseach, current Tánaiste Leo Varadkar declared a national homeless and housing crisis in Ireland. More than 4 years later, we have over 10,000 people living in emergency homeless accommodation, record high rental costs, and an increasingly unstable housing market. So the next section we're going to talk about is why, building on that, why we need a referendum on the right to housing. I'm going to hand over to Aoife.
Thank you, Wayne. So I know we've just spoken there for a few minutes about the level of housing crisis. I'm just going to speak now about why we specifically feel that a referendum on a right to housing is an essential aspect of addressing this situation. At a really basic level, the Constitution is a statement of the fundamental values of the people of Ireland, and in that way it shapes government policy and legislation, and it also provides an important bedrock of protection for basic rights that transcends individual governments or particular developments of the day. People who are experiencing ongoing housing insecurity in the turbulent market we have right now are being failed by a gap in our Constitution as it addresses housing matters. Currently, the Constitution is fundamentally imbalanced toward private property rights without any equivalent right to housing being recognised explicitly or implicitly. And this means that the starting point of government policy and of legal analysis around the regulation of land and property is very much from the perspective of the property owner's right. And while there are restrictions in the Constitution for property rights in relation to the common good and in particular scenarios, this is very much a secondary perspective. And in more simple terms, the way that housing is addressed under the Constitution at the moment is very much through the lens of as a commodity and as an asset, and not through the lens as something that's essential for people to be able to meet their fundamental rights. The imbalance in the Constitution has proven repeatedly to fail people in need of housing in this country and has perpetuated issues like the high levels of vacancy and dereliction that we see across the country. It increases issues around land hoarding and has contributed to the housing crisis on many levels. That said, including a right to housing in the Constitution will not fix the housing crisis overnight, but it does have enormous potential to be a catalyst for change and to be a very profound statement through a referendum by the people of Ireland that they don't accept endemic housing crisis as a normal or natural state of affairs. Including a right to housing in the Constitution would place an onus on the state to develop its policies and practices to ensure that the right to housing is met and to ensure that adequate housing is available to people in Ireland, both now and into the future. As political and policy actors, members of the committee will have a unique understanding of the capacity for issues, no matter how important, to fall between different stools of responsibility. And recognising a right to housing on the Constitution would put a very clear message to government and to all levels of government that a guiding principle in their actions has to be considering how the right to housing can be met. In more practical terms, that means a renewed respect for the need for housing to be accessible, affordable and available to people and to meet the different levels of need we have in society, whether that's through universal design principles for people with disabilities, housing for people who are part of our ageing population, or dealing with families of different sizes and makeups. Home for Good very much wish to work closely with both this committee and with the Housing Commission to come across a process to reach a wording of a constitutional amendment that could recognise this right in a meaningful and impactful way, and ultimately to bring about a referendum that can be won to have this right recognised. Just to close our opening statement, I'm just going to very briefly read out the proposed constitutional amendment that Home for Good has come up with, which would be the insertion of a new Article 43A into the Constitution that would state: "The state recognises and shall vindicate the right of all persons to have access to adequate housing, and the state shall, through legislative and other measures, provide for the realisation of this right through its available resources." Thank you.